Hi everybody, it's Sarah here from Collections Trust, just with a quick introduction to the recording of our panel discussion on loans in lockdown that we filmed on the 1st of July 2020. We did have a few audio issues at the start of the discussion for the first few minutes. So our panel have very kindly re-recorded their introductions and their responses to the first question that we went through. So you're going to see those first, and then the rest of the discussion will continue as usual. So thanks again for all of your questions that you submitted. We did prioritise the questions related to lockdown because that was the theme that we advertised, but then we did manage to get through a few other questions just about loans in general and historic loans and a few other loans topics. So I hope you enjoy it, and thanks for watching.
Okay, so I'd like to start with some introductions from all of our panelists. So if we could have a brief introduction just before we get into our questions, starting with David, please.
Thanks, Sarah. Hello, everybody. My name is David Packer. I am the Registrar of the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge and also currently serving as the chair of the UK Registrars Group.
Great, thanks, David. And then if we could have an introduction from Carol, please.
Hello, I'm Carol Warner and I manage the UK Government Indemnity Scheme. It's a UK scheme putting in place indemnity for objects that are coming into the UK from anywhere around the world.
Great, thank you. Okay, so an introduction from Lynn, please.
Hi, so I'm Lynn Stevens, one of the registrars at National Museum Scotland, and like most registrar teams, we manage the loans programme, loans out, loans in. We have touring exhibitions, and I in particular manage a programme of long-term and historic loans.
Excellent, thank you, Lynn.
Hello, my name is Charlotte Dew and I work as the Professional Development Manager at the Touring Exhibitions Group, responsible for training and research. Probably most pertinent to this conversation is that I managed the Preparing to Borrow programme over the last few years, which resulted in the Preparing to Borrow report.
Brilliant, thank you, Charlotte. So our first question that we had submitted was around emerging from lockdown. So as we re-emerge from lockdown and return to work, what would you recommend as priority tasks from a loans management perspective? And I think if we could come to Carol first of all, and then we'll see if the other panelists have anything to add.
Thank you. In terms of from a loans perspective, I would recommend, first of all, following any government and public health guidance, and also ensure that staff and protocols are in place for condition checking. I think that's the main thing that I would focus on. When you're going back into an environment which has been in lockdown for perhaps up to 16 weeks, you may be in an organisation where staff have not had access to the building at all, or whether staff have been in place but they may not necessarily have had expertise around condition checking. So I would just take care, it's part of your duty of care to take care for the objects. Look at the conditions around the wider security and the environment. If there's any deviation from any of the meeting those conditions, then think about that, think about what the action needs to take place in rectifying that. Also look at where the objects are. They may well have been moved during lockdown. So not only are you looking at the spaces within the original display area, but you're also looking in the storage area. Part of the advice that we gave when you were in lockdown was to take keep records of any checks, who those checks were done by, when, and what any remedial action coming out of that. So I would emphasize maintaining those records. Think about the relative humidity and the temperature. Again, you're looking at any deviations from meeting I'm talking about indemnity, but it could be in any respect, meeting those conditions. Checking for pest. And again, we issued some guidance in June as a follow-up in preparation for returning to opening up. And linked to that guidance was checklists that have been prepared by ICOM, and it gives you that checklist for what they call reawakening the collections, which I think is very helpful in terms of looking at that as a priority list. So it's really looking at the condition, the objects, where the objects are, feeling confident that there isn't any deviation. If there is, and you need to talk to the owner, then do so, but also talk to the insurance company, and in our case, talk to Government Indemnity.
Great, thanks, Carol. Some great advice. And I think your first point around checking guidance is a really important one, because obviously we're filming this on the 1st of July 2020, just to get that full date in there. So any advice government-wise or government indemnity-wise may well change by the time some of you are watching this back. So I think that's a really, really good point. Great, thanks, Carol. And David, did you have anything to add to Carol's response to that question?
Yes, please. I suppose thinking also about the loans out that institutions may have had and that were in place over the course of the lockdown, then you're going to be thinking about starting the practical arrangements to recover those, or you may have been in touch with your opposite numbers over the course of the lockdown, although some of them may have been, or lots of people were on furlough as well. So you might be coming from a bit more of a standing start in order to do that. And so you'll need to bear in mind that transport companies, for example, aren't up to full capacity yet, that different areas are emerging from lockdown at different rates. And so you'll probably need to allow extra time in order to put the arrangements in place to recover items and to decide what measures you're going to take for the installation, repacking and the return transport, and when you can take delivery of things. So yes, it's important to be re-establishing or continuing or re-establishing contact with your contacts elsewhere where you have loans in place, and deciding what to do if you have not done that already. Many exhibitions actually have been extended, and some places are running on longer or reopening to the public for a little while before they come back as well. So everybody's schedules are going to have been totally rearranged over the course of the lockdown as well.
Great. Carol, did you have something to add? Yes.
Yes, sorry, David's just reminded me. If you do need to buy time, because there's going to be a lot of logistics around, and you may well be inundated with requests to return those objects as well. So if you do need to buy time, then it's really important to apply for and ask for an extension. That can easily be arranged. And likewise, you would probably have a similar conversation with an insurance company, but do get in touch with us. I mean, we spent most of the time in lockdown putting in extensions to make sure there's no gap in cover. And we'd be very happy to continue to do that if that's what's required in terms of, as I say, buying that time, picking up on David's point.
Great. And David wants to come back in again. Go for it, David.
I will, if I may. Also to say that there are going to be differing working practices in place now as well. So actually, as you go through the process of coming back into contact with objects and loans, that the COVID-19 sort of safe working for staff and for contractors are going to be in place. So again, will likely mean more time in order to get things done, and also will have to be a rethink about how you go about doing some of those activities.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Great, thank you both. Okay, so just a reminder of our first question to open it up now. As we re-emerge from lockdown and start returning to work, what would you recommend as priority tasks for from a loans management perspective? So Lynn, did you have any response to that question?
Yes, I would say, in addition to what Carol said, I would say that communication is really key, and regular communication. So if you haven't already been in touch with your borrowers and lenders while you've been in lockdown, to do that as soon as possible, just so if there are any issues about object checks and building checks, they're not going to come out of the blue as a nasty surprise for someone. And really just as well reassuring them about the kind of things that you are doing. But I think communication's absolutely key at this point.
So Charlotte, do you have any thoughts on that question?
So my thought would be in relation to commercial insurance. Obviously, we would encourage people to apply to be covered by government indemnity, but where that isn't possible and they've used a commercial insurer, do check that you have a continuity of insurance if a loan has been extended or the circumstances have changed at all, because without that continuity, if you have a break, your insurer is likely to ask you to do another condition check, which could be difficult at the moment, particularly if the object is in an organisation you can't reach very easily or abroad. And also your premium is likely to go up if you aren't having those discussions before the end of the insurance period. So particularly with furloughed staff and people out of the office, just keeping an eye on your dates and whether or not you're insured, I think, is a really important thing to do.
The next question we had, we had a couple of questions that we're sort of going to wrap into one. And I think if we come to Charlotte, first of all, for this question about couriering, which we could probably do a whole hour on couriering, but we're going to have to try and do a question on couriering. So how might couriering be affected by social distancing or quarantine measures if they remain in place for a significant period? And just generally, how might we adapt the ways in which we work with couriers going forwards?
So I think this is a really interesting question, although I think the conversation about couriering actually started in advance of our lockdown circumstances, and certainly at TEG we were starting to think about how we could encourage more risk-based responses to the need for a courier. So what is really and truly necessary within the particular circumstances in which you're operating. But I think the lockdown offers us a really specific and exciting opportunity to review what we're doing and to embrace some of the new and innovative tools which are digital to monitor objects where it is possible that a person can't be present. I think as we have done in terms of embracing the digital environment in other areas of work, couriering is a really primary area we could do this. I've been very interested in packages such as Articheck and how they've been expediting the development in this area during lockdown. And obviously there are plenty of other packages that you can use, but I think looking to how that might assist. The other thing is through the research that TEG did a couple of years ago into lending and borrowing practice, one of the key pieces of feedback from regional venues was that couriers were being sent without acknowledging the specific on-site expertise, particularly in objects that were being loaned to them. So you might actually have a much more experienced member of staff on site at the borrowing venue than the courier is in that specific type of object. So my suggestion would be, within that idea of managing risk in the very best way possible, have a conversation and see what expertise there is, because it might save someone having to travel and overcome the challenges that the lockdown poses in this area.
Great, thank you, Charlotte. Did anyone else want to weigh in on the topic of couriering going forwards? Yep, David, go for it.
I will, if I may. So yes, I mean, I think it is potentially an opportunity for us to focus again on the specific risks that we want to mitigate by using a courier. And this is something that's come up quite a lot in discussions with some of the European registrars. And I think there is certainly a keenness, there is enthusiasm for continuing to use virtual tools, even as lockdown starts to lift in various places, that actually it takes a place alongside other existing risk mitigation practices, I suppose, as something we can use, because we all know that couriers, both for lender and borrower, is resource heavy and cost heavy. So that it will take a place, like as Charlotte said, to use the technology that's available innovatively if we can, to try to make sure that it does take a place alongside other traditional courier practices. The other thing as well is things like tracking devices coming back to the fore. I know that we pursued this idea with a prompt from Arts Council, in fact, about using tracking devices, and actually those are moving on to other generations now as well. So that is another possibility that can be added to our armoury, as it were.
Great. And I think I saw Carol, did you put your hand up at one point? Would you like to come in on that question?
Yes, I did. I think it's a wonderful opportunity to look at other ways of risk management around this area, and I've been very interested to see how the virtual Couriering idea has gone forward. Obviously, within indemnity, I can't endorse at this stage any commercial activity, and I'm just mindful that there will be owners who have insisted on the need for a courier, whether it's a high value object or a vulnerable object. And so I just wanted to reassure people that whilst you may be asked to have a courier from nail to nail and in transit, especially to accompany the object, there is a way of splitting that, because obviously certain travel restrictions won't even allow anybody anywhere near the borders or in the airports at loading. So you can have a courier this side within the UK up to that point of where the border is, and then have the lender's courier at the other end. So use that as an opportunity to negotiate around, as I say, a split courier, and avoid going straight to commercial insurance.
Yeah, David, or David and Lynn. So David got in there first. So David and then Lynn will come for you. Yeah.
Also, I think throughout all of this, it has been really reassuring to see that the institutions have still maintained the commitment to carry on lending, which is great. But I suppose also to stress that the need for flexibility around courier nominations and assignments, and the fact that travel and transport arrangements will continue to change, I think, for the coming months, as far as we can see, sometimes at very short notice, so that we might have to move from one mode to another quite quickly.
Yeah, and Lynn, you had something to say as well?
Yeah, just really, excuse me, just to add on to what everyone said, risk management is bread and butter for registrars, and that's what this is all about: case by case risk assessment of each loan. Does it need a physical courier? Is that possible within the regulations? Does it need a virtual one? How's that going to work? And obviously UKRG have already posted some really good guidance on that. And I would say, follow the sort of professional guidance that's been published. But also I would just say, I think there's been a lot of, when I've been discussing it with colleagues, there's been lots of focus on the sort of delivery and collection point, so how that physically works, and condition checking. But just to mention as well, to include packing in your risk assessment, because obviously there's sort of two big areas of risk there. That most damage happens in transit, so if you've got to be really careful about it's packed properly to mitigate that risk, but also the risk of handling materials and working closely together to pack things. So that's the only thing I would, don't forget the packing bit in your risk assessment. Yeah.
Great, thanks Lynn. So the next question I wanted to come on to, and actually Lynn, we'll come to you first for this one actually, was a question from somebody who has an object on loan to another museum. That loan is approaching its end date. So first of all, I'm really pleased to hear that they had an end date. That's sort of what Loans 101. And they've had an out of office message. So they've clearly tried to contact that museum to negotiate a renewal or a return perhaps. The out of office message tells them that the person responsible who they'd normally deal with for managing loans has been furloughed. Is there anything they can or should do? And I would like to add to that question, really, what should the borrower have done if that person was going on furlough? Yeah. So a couple of questions there, Lynn.
Yeah. Well, yes, first of all, hooray, there's an end date and it's not a permanent loan. Hooray. So, I mean, my experience in dealing with a lot of long-term loans at the minute is that most people, when they've put their out-of-office furlough message on, have given another contact name. Clearly, if that isn't the case, I mean, we're usually lending to organisations as opposed to private individuals. So there's usually a website or a social media platform where you can contact the organisation as a whole. So it's really just a bit of investigation to finding somebody else. And it might be someone that knows absolutely nothing about loans, but it's a point of contact, and you as the expert can reassure them about what you can put in place to either extend the loan or, delay the collection or whatever. And I think Charlotte was touching on earlier as well, make sure they understand what their insurance obligations and their contract obligations once you've got hold of someone. But I think it's very, very unlikely you won't be able to get hold of somebody in an organisation. And, you know, the nature of furloughing is that usually it's the more senior people that haven't been furloughed, so they're more in a position to make a decision as well. So that's quite good. In terms of what the borrower should be doing, if you're going to be furloughed, you know you have loans from other organisations, make sure you contact the lenders and give them a point of contact, you know, just about that sort of communication. I know sometimes people have been furloughed at very short notice, so that's been very difficult. But yeah, even if as a minimum you have in your out of office reply another point of contact, that would be the main thing, I think. Yeah.
Lovely, thank you, Lynn. Did anyone want to come in on that question? Although I think that's a very thorough answer. So great, excellent. And I think your point about maybe more people at senior level being maybe the person now responsible is in some ways maybe an opportunity for them to learn about how the management of loans and how important it is and all of those sorts of things as well. So that's great. Thanks, Lynn. So moving on to, I guess, a sort of technical question about loans. And I think it's a question that could apply to loans generally, but I think the reason it was asked was from a lockdown perspective. So this person who asked the question doesn't have a printer at home. So I suspect, as I say, that that's because they're working from home when normally they would be managing their loans in the office. So they've asked, what's the best way to sign a loan agreement if you don't have access to a printer? So they can't print and send one to get a signature and have posted back. Can they use an electronic signature, a digital signature, something else? So is there anything that can be done? And we'll come to David first of all for a response, please.
Yes, you can. So for the most part, it does mean it's going to be electronic or digital signatures that have to be used here. We were talking a bit earlier on about the difficulties of not having access to a printer at home. But again, in other ways, there are possible advantages in the sense that it has moved along the idea of using electronic signatures quite rapidly. As with all contracts, the same basic things apply, which is that the signatories have to have the capacity to sign, the authority to sign, and the intention to carry out the terms of the contract. And that is what is being made clear. And as long as that remains clear in an electronic signature, then it can take various forms, which is my understanding. It can be typed in and a typed in date. On the other hand, there are secure document signing packages or platforms available. So things like DocuSign is referred to quite a lot, or Adobe Sign, other packages, other platforms are available in order to do this, which are password protected and give a confirmed date stamp for when that signature was applied. So it can take various forms. As I said, the same requirements as for any contract apply. To back that up and to make that clear, then it's also important that the email exchanges or the correspondence exchanges around or leading up to the signing of the contract are also helpful to retain, so that can be demonstrated. Again, I suppose to reiterate that in our context, for the most part, contracts are along a pattern that we're all familiar with. So loan agreements and touring contracts, generally speaking, quite familiar. The terms are quite familiar to us. And also, almost invariably, the parties to those contracts go into them with an enormous amount of goodwill. So it is not usual or not often the case that you'll end up in having to go through the sort of dispute resolution or arbitration in the course of a contract like that. We generally speak issues out. But nonetheless, I think as a basic legal requirement, then that's what the case is. You can sign them off electronically, and in many ways it doesn't have to be a wet ink signature, and in many ways it can be very helpful and very useful in speeding up the process.
Great, thanks, David. So you may have noticed, the eagle eyes amongst you, that Carol has just, I think, lost her connection. So hopefully she will rejoin us. But luckily, I think we've asked her all the direct questions that we had for Carol. So that's good. So fingers crossed she'll come back at some point. I know that yesterday, or Monday rather, she was having some internet issues. So I'm sure it's just as simple as that. But thank you, David. Did anyone else have anything to add on the topic of hard copy loan agreements versus things like digital signatures? Yep, Charlotte.
I think it was just a broader point about that, which is that we found that if organisations work in that way, it means that, especially if they use a bespoke piece of software or, you know, of a paid piece of software to sign, it means that things are stored digitally and centrally. So actually, it's much better file management for your organisation. So again, looking to the benefits of this situation. And one of the things that TEG have been lobbying for a little while now is having email addresses which are not distinct to people but offer you a way into making loans inquiries and having loans paperwork going to a central place. So that can be another benefit of doing things digitally. Things are all going into the same place, and I think when people have been furloughed, it means you've got much better access to the files. It's really important that someone who's not within the registrarial team or the curatorial team knows that they can find these kinds of documents. As Lynn said, a person within senior management might be called on to deal with something, and if they can't find the necessary paperwork, then that's going to make their job harder. So again, I think looking to the benefits of this, I think digital signatures and that kind of approach is really positive for the future.
Great, thank you, Charlotte. Lynn, anything to add to that? Only because you're the only other person in the room who has to respond to it, not to pick on you particularly.
No, not really. I mean, just I think as David was saying as well, just again, work out what you can realistically achieve, and just make sure that if you need some contract or a confirmation email about the intent, you can, depends what you can do. If you've got the software to do an electronic signature, fantastic. And, if not, just making sure that it's really clear in those communications that you are signing up to the contract. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Lynn. And welcome back, Carol. Nice to have you back. So we were just talking, Carol, about electronic signatures, digital signatures, and we've had a few really good responses. So I think we'll move on to the next question that we had, which was around something that, in fact, you, Lynn, mentioned in your introduction. So I think, again, it probably makes sense to come to you first for this one, as it's something you mentioned. The long-term loan that's maybe lacking some paperwork. So what experiences have you had with long-term loans and lack of paperwork? And do you have any specific advice? So I'm thinking here that what they're probably hinting at is maybe where you can't identify or can't trace the lender, sorry, and you're maybe trying to return something. So what's your experience and advice on that, Lynn?
Yeah, I mean, so untraceable loans or orphan works, the two different terms that are used, and I deal with this a lot. So I would say first thing is to have a signed off procedure for dealing with it within your organisation, if you don't already have one. If you are starting from scratch, there are some really good toolkits from, I think, Collections Trust and MA, and probably, I think, UKRG as well. So yeah, go and look for those, or just speak to other registrars who've got experience, and just make sure that process is signed off and that every loan is dealt with in a consistent way, really. It's about due diligence and consistency, really. So just, very briefly, you try and make contact. If you don't have any contact details, which it sounds like this, you don't. I always find longer serving members of staff and ex-members of staff sometimes have little nuggets of information about who's connected with what. So it's always worth asking those questions of your colleagues. Obviously you can't dispose of these items. They don't belong to you. Sometimes that's really frustrating because they're taking up storage space, especially if they're large items or large collections of items. But I think the best advice I can give is to deal with it as far as you can, because I think what's happened, everyone will admit this in every organisation, that there will be historic loans that are untraceable, and quite often it's because people haven't dealt with them in the past, and they will always come back to bite you. So, as part of that signed off central process, or, manage the risk as well by looking at what you actually have. So, maintaining a record of how many you have and where they are, and what you have done to try and deal with them. as part of the untraceable process at National Museums of Scotland, we have them, once we've decided they're definitely untraceable and we've explored every avenue, then they become accessions, but with the caveat that if a legitimate third-party claim arises, they can then be transferred back to the owners. It just means it's an easier way then you can deal with the objects in terms of documenting them and dealing with them. But there isn't a magic wand about how you can get them out of your store if you can't contact anyone, I'm afraid.
Great.
I don't know if that's helpful.
No, that's really helpful, Lynn. And I think it's especially important you mentioned this, but I just want to reiterate how important it is to document those efforts and what nuggets you have found, even if you're not 100% confident, just sort of recording it so that for succession planning, the next person understands where you got to in that process that you set out. I think that's a really important
due diligence, that's really vital. So, you know, you can absolutely record the efforts you have made to try and work out the ownership of an object or a contact person. Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks, Lynn. Did anyone else have any thoughts? There is a follow-up question on historic loans in terms of if there's any damage that's occurred, but did anyone, first of all, have any follow-up on Lynn's response to just the sort of general trying to identify and trace lenders? There you go. Such a good response, Lynn.
Yeah,
David, yeah.
Yeah, I did. Yeah, I mean, I think exactly as Lynn said, it's important to emphasise that they stay as loans effectively, and all of your documentation needs to reflect the fact that they remain as loans, even if at that particular point it's proving difficult to trace who the owner is or who the responsible person is. It also means that it affects some of your decisions further down the line as to how you might use that object. So if the object is to be put into a display, or if you're going to publish it, or somebody else wants to request an image of it. Again, it's case by case. You have to balance up what the risks are. On the other hand, if you do publish it, then it can mean that it prompts an approach from somebody who does have an interest in that object. And in any case, if you are using the resources to continue to look after it, then it should be utilised as part of the collection. So, but as I say, as long as it's clear what the status is. We did quite a lot of work on this in the past about what we can do about it and whether or not you can accession objects and so on. But yeah, I think the answer came back quite clearly that they have to remain as loans, and it has to be absolutely clear to you that that's the case.
Great, thanks, David. And there is definitely some guidance which is on the Collections Trust website, which it's not exclusively about loans, but there are a couple of pieces of guidance around that, which I will make sure go in as links following this. So thanks, Lynn, for reminding me to do that. So the follow-up that we had was around another historic loan scenario. So what's the best way to deal with a loan that's been held for, quote, a very long time and is not in the condition it was given to you in? What would happen if the loan was beyond repair? So we don't have a length of time, but a very long time. What would happen in that case? Lynn, do you have any experience of that coming back to you?
Yeah, again, you know, you have to grasp the thistle and be honest about these things. You can't, again, just, you know, hope it will go away, because it will come back at some point. And, you know, morally, you should be dealing with it as well. So, or ethically, I should say. So I think the first thing before you do anything in terms of contacting the owners is agree amongst your organisation and with your senior managers about how you're going to tackle it. Again, depending on how big your organisation is, but, you know, if you have in-house conservators, you would get them to assess it and write a treatment proposal, or you might get an external conservator to do that for you. You may even, depending on the significance of the object or any political sensitivities around it, you may also talk to your press office about how you might respond to this in the public domain. And this isn't to be sort of devious and behind the scenes. This is just, you know, again, risk management about how you are going to deal with it, and that you have already thought of all the questions and issues that might arise, so you're not caught on the hop when you do contact the owner. I think there's also, you know, around the sort of being that I keep saying about being honest. I'm not suggesting museums and galleries aren't, but, you know, I think sometimes the public perception is that things are sort of hidden away, and I think it's okay for us to say that museum practices have changed, and museums have been around for decades, if not centuries. So, you know, practices have changed, and there may have been times when I think the question said that this loan had been there a very long time. So there may have been conservation treatments that now don't happen that may have damaged the object. It may be about poor storage, but the storage has since changed. So again, it's important to think when the damage has occurred, whether it's recent damage, despite the loan being there a long time. So I think in the communication with the lender, with the owner, it's about being honest about how we have come to this situation and offering a route out of the situation by offering to cover the conservation costs and asking them what they would like to happen. I think that's probably the main things to consider. I don't think I've left anything out.
No, that's great. And whenever anyone asks a question when they have an issue with something like this, whether it's documentation or otherwise, I always like to focus as well on the prevention and the lessons learned. So obviously nowadays it would be covered in the loan agreement what happens if the object gets damaged and what you have to do. So it sounds like this is a lesson learned going forward around making sure that that's all covered. Yeah, great. Thanks, Lynn. Did anyone else have any thoughts on that scenario?
Just to chip in, I suppose, if it observes situations where there have been loans, it might not necessarily be private individuals, but loans from companies that have since folded, or even government departments that have since, on multiple occasions, been rolled into another department or reformed or whatever. So in fact, there is nobody to whom you can, with whom you can speak about what to do. And again, if you're assessing or grappling with a situation of something that needs intervention, then again, you have to make those efforts to try to trace it. So it may well be that if the Office of Public Works, as it used to be, is now then went on to the Department of the Environment, which is now part of DEFRA, which is, so there's no way really that you're going to get hold of somebody, but I think you have to at least lodge the communication. And it may well be, again, that you have to make some decisions about the costs incurred and whether to undertake intervention work, at least to stabilize an object immediately, sort of unilaterally, I guess, to prevent further deterioration or damage. But again, you have to document that decision-making process, what efforts you made, and how that decision was arrived at.
Yeah, great. Thanks, David. So one more question before we move on to a sort of wrap-up question, which I'll come to all of you for. But Charlotte, if you're happy for me to come to you first with this question, it was around balancing the needs in terms of standards and in terms of best practice of documentation, condition checks, all of those things that are really, really important. With some groups, in the question specifically says community groups, if you're lending from a community group, can sometimes feel that documentation is red tape and it can feel a little bit overwhelming or a bit time consuming. So how would you suggest, or any thoughts on how you can create that balance? So you've got your accountability, your documentation, condition checks, but it not feeling too overwhelming for for either the borrower or the lender, actually. Any thoughts on that, Charlotte?
Well, I think that all of these procedures are there to protect everybody involved. So I guess I wouldn't on any level be an advocate for not using due process, because that puts the object and the people involved at risk, and the institution. I think probably when I've been in this situation, I've actually used it as a sort of moment for sharing knowledge and information. So particularly working with community groups, talking about how you and why you condition check, and the process that you're going through, and actually you can make it quite fun and interesting for them. I think if you demonstrate that you just want to take the very best care of the object. I think if you're in a situation where they are suggesting it's red tape, I think having a telephone conversation and talking about it and explaining why it's got to happen is probably the best way to solve it. So yeah, I'm afraid it's a fact of what we do. I don't think we can change it really, other than how we manage relationships and partnerships. I think that's the important bit.
Great, thanks, Charlotte. Anyone else? Yeah, Lynn. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, just as Charlotte was saying, really making sure that you are communicating why those museum practices are important, and you're not doing it just to tick a box. And also, because a lot of time the museum world is alien to a lot of people in terms of what goes on behind the scenes, so that they don't necessarily understand why certain things have to happen, and also just I've always found it's been useful to explain that it's also protecting them, so that it's not just a case of, oh, we're being difficult and we want to make it, you jump through all these hoops. It's also about making sure that their liability is minimized as well, and that their reputation is being protected and all that sort of thing. So I think quite often I try and turn it around. So say, this isn't just about what we're doing for our benefit. This is also, to protect you and to make sure that, you come out of this as sort of, a good borrower. So.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Great. Thanks, Lynn. So the final question I wanted to ask as a wrap up, I'd like to come to all of you in order, and fingers crossed, I know Carol's been dipping in and out, but fingers crossed she's there just with her camera off. So in fact, maybe if we come to Carol first, just in case she has any issues, if she's there. The question was, in your opinion, what do you and this might be a difficult question because I'm going to ask you to say one thing. In your opinion, what do you think is key to successfully managing loans, but is often maybe forgotten about or overlooked? So something that you think is really key, but people sometimes overlook. So if we could come to Carol first of all, and I think you're there. I can see you've unmuted.
Okay, hope you can hear me. So I was almost going to repeat what's just been said, because for me, it's having that complete and accurate documentation. I'm always coming at it from an indemnity perspective. So in the event of a claim or a dispute, not having that clear documentation, it's too easy with everybody having worked so hard to secure the loan and then to slip with continuing with the documentation. So I would just re-emphasize that as something that's perhaps may well be overlooked, especially where there is no expertise within the institution.
Great, thanks, Carol. And then if we carry on in reverse order, David, if you're happy to give us your thoughts next, and then it'll be Charlotte and Lynn, just so you can start thinking.
I'll tell you, and again, it links back to the last question a little bit, which I suppose that it's quite possible that we'll be working quite a lot more with community groups rather than other institutions, I guess, as the complexion or the landscape changes coming ahead. But in those instances, it is useful to make sure it's clear what the reasons for your procedures. It's not always clear, and if they are opaque, and I'm conscious that sometimes my institution is not always that clear in the same way that if you're dealing with non-institutional partners, but even so, even with other institutions, about being clear about what your process is and why those particular things are in place, I think that can be really useful in terms of the ongoing communication through the course of a loan. And as I said, I think that works for community groups, for individuals, and for other institutions.
Great, thanks, David. And final thoughts from you, Charlotte.
So my immediate answer to this question would always be good communication. So I won't repeat that because I think that's been really emphasised well by David. But just reflecting on this question in the light of our current circumstances, it's emphasised for me that the contracts, the agreements and all the documentation that we have around these processes should be seen as live and evolving documents. So we have these, they're in place. We've probably used similar documents for many, many years, but actually through the COVID situation, which is so unexpected and so all-encompassing, there are probably things that we should reflect on and update our agreements and documents in light of that. And so I would say always see your procedures and your documents as live things that should adapt and evolve and reflect the particular circumstances. In relation to COVID, I think probably things that relate to objects being unexpectedly kept in a certain place. How was that covered, or how is that covered in your agreements? And also how you talk about cost and the sharing of costs when there are the potential for large increases in cost as a result of a particular situation. So how are you best within your organisation managing the impacts of things through the agreements that you have? So it's I think it's good practice always, but I think our current circumstances have emphasised that even more.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and that's something that I've definitely picked up on from museums in various different sessions, that they are finally getting some of their procedures out and looking at them for the first time in a long time. So I think you're right. Definitely being responsive in that way is really important, and continually reviewing how you do things. Great, thanks, Charlotte. And finally, from Lynn.
Slightly biased, but I would say don't forget your long-term loans in lieu of all the very pressing short-term loans for exhibitions. Just maintain regular contacts and correspondence with your lenders and borrowers, because that's the kind of thing, it can slip under the busyness of exhibition programs and touring exhibitions and everything else. So just make sure the longer term loans are regularly reviewed and that you are keeping up to date with contact details. Otherwise, it does become a problem later on, as we have seen in our questions.
Yeah, no, exactly. No, absolutely. Yeah, no, that's a really good plug for that. Yeah, don't forget about your long-term loans. Easily done, easily done. Okay, great. So thanks again to everyone who submitted a question. You might notice that I maybe reworded or sort of squeezed a few together, but hopefully you did recognise the gist of your question if you did submit one. But we are just out of time. We've definitely done an hour now in the various different platforms that we've ended up doing this in. So apologies again if you were watching live. We will save the video, and I've been recording the audio in 2 different places. So fingers crossed we'll be able to bring the 2 together, the video and the audio, and post that up. And just a final thank you for our lovely panel who could not be ruffled by that issue with the live streaming. So you're all very very calm and collected. So thank you very much for that, and for your very thoughtful responses as well. So thank you very much, and see you all hopefully again soon.